Welcome back, traveler of old roads and forgotten stories. Tonight, we leave behind wind-swept plains and caravan trails and step softly into the hush beneath the earth, where stone walls drip with hidden veins of silver and iron, and men and boys vanish at dawn into tunnels carved with pickaxes and stubborn hope. In the world above, lords and knights carve their names into castles of stone. Monks copy prayers onto thin sheets of vellum, and peasants bend their backs to the slow rhythm of the plow. But below, far from sunlight, far from the eyes of kings, the miners dig. They breathe dust and cold, damp, hunting the hidden veins that keep coins bright in noble coffers and swords sharp in distant wars. Tonight, we drift downward with them, into shafts held up by timber that creaks like a living thing, into air so close you taste the rock on your tongue, into a life measured not by acres of field, but by feet of dark stone pressed above your head. So settle in now, let your breath slow, let the world above fade to a quiet memory. We will listen for the pick's soft rhythm, the murmur of old prayers whispered in lantern glow, the hush that lingers where light dares not go. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing at the mouth of a narrow shaft, carved roughly into a hillside, thick with brambles and the scent of damp earth. Dawn is only just breaking above, but here, in this little hollow beneath the trees, the sun's promise is already swallowed by stone. Around you, a handful of men gather, wool cloaks pulled tight, boots caked in last night's rain, faces hidden behind thick smudges of soot that no washing ever quite lifts away. Their hands are rough, nails broken and lined with the grit of the last shaft they dug. Someone hands you a small iron lamp, a flickering flame that sputters as you lift it into the stale breath of the tunnel's mouth. The air tastes of cold clay and old smoke, tinged with something sharper, the faint sting of metal and the promise of deeper things hidden where the sun never reaches. You duck inside, feeling the walls tighten around your shoulders, almost at once. Cold stars. Inside, the hush deepens. Voices fall to murmurs, breath soft against damp rock. Somewhere ahead, you hear the steady clink of iron striking stone, a sound older than any castle, older than the kingdom that taxes each pound of metal hauled out on aching backs. Your job is simple but endless. Swing the pick, wedge loose rock free, mingling with the dust that drifts off each new blow of the pick. There is no fresh breeze here, only the stale breath of men and the deep cold that seeps through your skin. No matter how thick your wool or how tightly you bind your sleeves, water trickles down the walls, whispering of distant springs and rains that will never reach this deep. Now and then, the tunnel creaks, a soft groan of timber protesting the weight of the world above it. You pause, lamp lifted high, eyes squinting at the beams, braced like ribs in a dark throat. You trust the wood because you must. There is no other choice. The deeper the vein, the more the Lord demands. The more he demands, the deeper you crawl. Your hands blister where the pick's handle rubs raw against your palm. Your knees bruise where you kneel in muck to wedge a stubborn rock free. Your breath rasps, your throat stings, but above you, the hush holds steady, the soft, living silence of earth, reminding you that every coin struck in silver began here, in this cold breath beneath the hillside. When your shift ends, the sun has climbed high above the woods outside, but you see none of it yet. Behind you, the tunnel breathes on, waiting for tomorrow and the next day. and the next pair of hands willing to trade daylight for the soft hush of stone and ore. Listen to the pick's steady rhythm, not loud, but relentless, like a heartbeat buried too deep to stop. Each strike against the wall sends a shiver through your gloves, up your wrist, into your shoulders, until the ache becomes as much a part of you as the lamp flickering by your side. The others move around you like ghosts. A boy slips past, dragging a sled of broken stone behind him, the rough rope cutting raw grooves into his palms. He does not meet your eyes. He knows what you know now, that speaking here wastes breath better saved for the climb back to daylight. Every few feet, someone pauses to test the timber props with the flat of their palm, feeling for any tremble that might warn of a ceiling ready to sigh its weight into your small. If the wood groans too loud, if the beams bow, there's no loud cry of alarm, just a quick hiss, a handful of words passed along the tunnel's bend, and everyone scrambles back along the slick floor, boots slipping in water, dark as ink. Sometimes you pass old tunnels, half-collapsed drifts, where timbers rotted years ago. A trickle of water seeps from their mouths, carrying flakes of rust and the faint, bitter scent of iron. You feel the urge to peer inside, just for a breath, to see if some hidden vein still gleams in the torchlight. But the others tug you away. Old tunnels are hungry. They remember every careless step. The deeper you crawl, the thinner the air. Some tunnels grow so tight you must lie on your belly pressed to stone so cold it leaches the warmth from your chest. Here, the youngest slip forward. Boys whose thin shoulders can wiggle where grown men cannot. They carry tiny picks, small lamps. They scrape silver or tin or coal from seams so narrow you wonder if the stone itself is breathing them in. Back where the shaft widens again, a miner pauses to take a sip of sour ale from a leather flask. There is no clean water here, not unless you trust the trickles that run down the rock, cold, but always shadowed by the taste of iron and the dust of old bones. Above your head, someone taps in a rhythm you come to understand. 3 knocks to signal a fresh prop in place, 2 to warn of timber shifted out of line. These soft signals drift through the dark like tiny prayers. You tap back, though your glove muffles the sound. You feel the answering thud against the pick handle in your palm, and for a moment you know you are not alone. Even when the hush presses so close, it feels like another layer of skin. When your lamp gutters, you scramble to relight it with trembling fingers. If it goes out for good, you do not linger. Few men risk the tunnel blind, not when the ceiling can groan without warning, not when a single wrong step can drop you into a pocket of flooded drift where water waits black and cold, eager to claim a careless boot. At the end of your shift, if you last the day, you drag your tools behind you, boots squelching through puddles of silvery sludge. Your shoulders brush rough rock that scrapes threads from your wool. Your breath tastes of soot and iron filings. When you stand at last at the mouth of the shaft, you pause. You feel the cold light on your cheeks. It feels thin and strange, almost unreal after the hush below. Behind you, the tunnel waits. Its darkness settles like a sigh, swallowing the last echoes of your steps, the last flecks of silver you freed with hands, now raw and trembling. Tomorrow, you know, you will crawl back in, because the coins must be struck, the Lord must be paid, and the hush, soft, heavy, patient, always waits for the next breath to vanish inside it. Now step gently from the cold hush below into the brittle light above, where the tunnels end and the Lord's manor begins. Here the hush changes shape. It hums behind thick doors, drifts through tapestries woven with bright threads, paid for by veins of silver, cut from the living rock. Picture a baron's hall in some damp corner of the Holy Roman Empire, its stones dark with the chill of northern mists. You stand on a flagstone floor, warmed by rushes and old firs. Tall windows slit the gloom but do not banish it. The sun comes grudgingly to these hills. In the flicker of a hearth, the baron sits. His cloak is lined with fur from distant forests. A thin chain of gold glints at his throat, soft metal drawn from mines, like the one you crawled through moments ago. In his hand, a goblet of wine too sour for kings, but sweet enough for a man who never swings a pick, yet profits from every stroke. On the table before him lie coins, bright and new, stamped with the mark of his house. He rolls one across his knuckles as he listens to a steward read lists of dues. How many carts of or hauled this month? How much tin bartered for salt? How many shovels and picks broken in the deeper shafts? Behind the steward stands a scribe, ink-stained fingers moving quick as he scratches numbers onto parchment. The parchment will roll up tight and travel by courier to the city's mint, where the silver will be struck into coins that bear not the miner's sweat but the baron's crest. Listen closer, and you'll hear the quiet complaints stitched inside these soft lists. Timber for new props grows costly. Flooded drifts eat away days of labor. A shaft collapsed last month. 3 men gone in a hush as heavy as the earth that swallowed them. The baron frowns, but does not weep. He taps the coin on the table, nods for deeper shafts to be dug. The vein must not stop. In a small chapel near the hall, a priest lights candles for the souls lost below. He says prayers in Latin that echo faintly off stone walls, dark with the soot of hundreds of such soft requests for mercy. The baron pays for these candles, too. A few coins flicked into the alms box, a small tithe to buy peace of mind when the hush presses close at night. Outside the hall, the village bends to the same hush. The blacksmith mends cracked picks. The charcoal burners feed the forges. Wives patch torn shirts worn thin against rough rock. Children run errands with baskets of salted fish and rye bread for men who will eat by lantern glow, far from any table set with silver goblets. Yet wealth flows here, slow and steady as water through seams of stone. The baron's manor swells with tapestries, polished brass plates, books inked by monks, paid with the hush of coins. Envoys from the nearest duke come knocking, asking for loans. The baron obliges. He can spare it. His tunnels breathe deep enough to promise more. But promises made by stone are never soft forever. In time, the best veins run thin. Timber grows scarce. Floods slip through old shafts, filling tunnels with black water that eats the props away. Men grow restless when wages shrink. Tools dull faster than the hope of finding new seams. The hush beneath the manor shifts, no longer a patient servant, but a threat waiting for its chance. In the hall, the baron taps another coin on the table. He orders new shafts, driven deeper, even as miners whisper about creaking roofs and rotten beams. The steward hesitates. The scribe scratches faster. The hush listens. When the ruin comes, it comes not with a roar, but a soft sigh. The sound of a tunnel giving way in the hush of dawn. Timbers snapping like brittle bones. Earth folding inward to swallow the last lamp, before its flame can flicker, a warning. The Baron's goblet still gleams on the high table. His crest still marks coins scattered through markets far beyond his hills. But beneath his feet, the hush claims its price. Slow, certain, patient as stone. The Baron's hall fades behind you like a thin dream of warmth and polished coin. The hush grows thicker again, pressing close as you duck your head under low beams and step carefully onto stone floors that remember every footstep ever taken here. Down in these shafts, not everything that went in came back out. The tunnels keep secrets tucked in damp corners and hidden drifts. Old tools wedged where the ceiling fell. Lanterns dropped and snuffed out when water rushed in faster than a man could run. Pickaxes rest against walls grown soft with dripping clay, their handles dark with sweat from hands long since returned to the same soil that presses so close above. Somewhere beyond a collapsed timber brace, a rusted shovel lies half buried in silt, its blade curled and thin, like a leaf pressed under stone for centuries. If you brush away the grit, you might see the faint lines carved into the handle, a mark, maybe a name, scratched there by a boy who swung it until the hush grew too heavy. When modern diggers break through these old veins, they find such traces more often than silver. A leather shoe, stiff as bark, wedged in a pocket of rock no bigger than a child's cradle. A tiny iron lamp, still black with soot, its wick long gone, but the smell of burned oil lingering like a memory of fire that once pushed back the hush for a few short hours. Beneath layers of broken shale and rusted nails, sometimes a tunnel holds more than tools. A collapsed shaft can trap the miner with the work itself. Bones found curled tight around the last blow of the pick. Ribs pressed flat by the world they tried to open. No name remains for these lost hands. The hush knows, though it holds the shape of their breath in the cool air that drifts through broken seams. Farther in, a forgotten gallery widens into a pocket of quiet so deep you feel it wrap around your shoulders. The timbers here lean in strange angles, like ribs frozen mid-breath from the ceiling. Water drips in a patient rhythm, falling onto stone worn slick by centuries of trickles. Each drop taps a hush that never breaks, a lullaby for picks left wedged in stone, for shovels leaning against walls that will never see the sun again. In some tunnels, faint scratches run across the rock lines carved by knives or nails. Some mark the passage of shifts in tally marks, scratched day by day in the lamp's flicker. Others shape symbols harder to read, charms to ward off the bad air, runes to keep the ceiling steady, a prayer left behind when the hush pressed in so close that a whispered plea seemed the only timber strong enough to hold back the earth. Archaeologists, centuries later, pick through these secrets like careful keepers of other people's quiet. They lift lamps and broken picks from the silt, brush clay from iron shackles once used to tie up runaway laborers who thought the hush outside the shaft was softer than the one within. They measure footprints stamped deep in old mud, the last step of a man who never turned back. Not every secret is grim. Now and then, a miner's lunch waits under the dust. A wooden bowl with a scrap of salted meat, a wedge of rye bread gone hard as stone, a pipe carved from clay, a coin tucked into a pocket seam for luck. Small things that speak of moments when the hush paused, just long enough for a man to sit on a rock and remember the warmth of his hearth far above. When you stand in these tunnels today, or imagine them from afar, you feel the hush curl around you, thick with all the breath left behind. It holds the memory of every swing of the pick, every muttered curse when stone proved stubborn, every soft promise made by the earth to those who trusted it would hold until the shift was done. Above, coins glitter in the baron's chest. Here, the hush keeps what the coins could never buy, the echo of hidden lives, stitched into the cold walls that still remember each whispered word, each flicker of a dying lamp, each breath that never found its way back to the light. Beyond the first shafts, where miners still come and go, older workings sleep untouched, sealed by cave-ins, or left when richer veins called men deeper still. Some passages twist and fold into the earth like veins in a buried hand, narrow enough that only a child could crawl through, wide enough in places to hold shadows that drift even when no breath stirs the stale air. Inside these abandoned galleries, the hush is more than silence. It is the soft weight of stone pressing down through centuries, wrapping around every trace left behind. A single nail driven into a timber brace, bent slightly sideways where a hurried hand struck it crooked. A scrap of leather cord wedged in a crack. Perhaps once a strap for a lamp, or a simple charm tied to keep the air sweet when stale fumes drifted up from deep seams. Sometimes, in the soft drip of water that eats slow lines into the walls, a small gleam catches the lantern's edge, a fleck of or never prized loose, or the smooth curve of a coin dropped and lost under a sudden collapse. Coins were rare in pockets here. When they fell, they stayed, hidden in cracks that whispered back every swing of the pick until the stone closed in again. Deeper in, the air sharpens with old minerals, lumps of charcoal scattered like crumbs along a drift. Mark where fires once burned to crack the rock face. An ancient trick older than any noble crest stamped on a silver coin. Miners would pile brushwood in narrow shafts, light it, and let the heat fracture stubborn stone. The charred bones of these fires lie buried in damp clay, black and brittle, but still sharp enough to smudge your fingers if you lift a piece to the lantern. Tools linger like ghosts. Iron wedges, rusted deep orange, hammerheads without handles, a pick frozen into a wall where its shaft snapped and the miner never returned to finish the job. Some tools bear marks cut by bored hands during short breaks, loops, crosses, little notches counting days, or perhaps tallying carts filled and hauled away. Here and there, a more secret thing appears. Shallow hollows scooped into a wall, lined with small lumps of wax, a hiding place for a scrap of bread or a secret stash of better or chipped out when the steward's eyes turned elsewhere. Tiny acts of survival in a world where every handful of bright stone might mean a new pair of boots for winter, a candle for the wife's shrine, a few coins slipped into a pocket when the tally men were not looking. When these hidden places break open again, centuries later, they breathe out stories, bits of cloth pinched between stone and timber, preserved by damp air thick with minerals that wrap old fibers in a crust of salt, the imprint of a hand pressed into clay, where a boy leaned too hard while waiting for his father to say it was safe to swing again. Not every tunnel holds bones, but some do. A collapsed drift may cradle the curled shape of a man pinned tight by a roof that gave no warning. His lamp is nearby, its base buried in sludge. its thin flame snuffed out so long ago that the last breath of its smoke still feels caught in the rock around it. Others find only emptiness, a passage that fades into raw stone where picks struck until the seam ran dry. Then was left to the hush, sealed behind a rotting timber door no one bothered to mark on a ledger, a corridor that ends at a face of glittering or never touched, too deep or too costly to reach once better veins called the picks elsewhere. In the hush of these burials, the miners' lives linger longer than any coin. The baron's crest fades from the world above, but here the marks of ordinary hands remain. A chipped pick, a scrawled name, a prayer carved where no priest would ever see it, but the earth might remember. What was left behind does not roar, it hums, a steady hush pressed deep under the hills, waiting for the next lamp to flicker near its edge, for curious eyes to lean close and listen to all that stone still keeps safe. Beyond the damp shafts and flickering lamps, a different hush hums through crooked streets and timbered houses perched on the slopes above the veins of silver and tin. Here, life presses close, not silent like the tunnels, but softer than the roar of distant cities. A steady murmur of footsteps on cobbles, iron pots rattling in hearth-lit kitchens, coins traded for fresh bread and salted fish in small markets under church spires, dark with centuries of soot. Picture the mining town clinging to the edge of a hillside scarred by shafts and spoil heaps. At first glance, it seems sturdy enough. Rows of timber-framed houses leaning together for warmth in winter winds. A chapel whose bell calls men up from the pits at dusk. A single muddy lane winding from the manor to the market square, where carts creak under sacks of ore bound for distant smelters. In these narrow streets, the hush shifts from stone to wood, from pick to purse. Every door holds a story shaped by the tunnels below. The widow selling scraps of wool to buy a candle for her husband's grave. The blacksmith who sharpens pickheads by lantern light while his children doze on straw by the forge. The innkeeper counting out coins earned from weary men who stagger in after a week beneath the hills. Pockets light but thirst heavy. The steward from the baron's hall might pass through at dawn, cloak pulled tight, his boots caked in the same hillside mud that clings to the miner's boots. He nods at the baker, the butcher, the priest, small signs of power echoing the greater hush above that keeps this village breathing coin into the manor's coffers. On feast days, the hush lifts a little. Laughter spills into the muddy lanes as ale barrels are rolled from low cellars, their iron hoops damp with last year's harvest. Children chase each other between timber beams that lean low over narrow alleys, shrieking for a moment as if the dark beneath the hills never touched their father's shoulders. Lanterns flicker behind small windows, soft candles burning through prayers offered in chapels built with silver, paid for by lungs full of dust. Yet the mines whisper through every corner. A miner's cough echoes behind shuttered doors. A pick leans by the hearth, handle worn smooth as bone. Boots dry by the fire, crusted with the same grit that seeps into every floorboard, every wool sleeve. Every cracked palm laid flat on a bar counter when the day's shift ends. Sometimes a vein runs rich, and the hush softens into a hum of promise. New roofs rise over old barns. The priest's robes gleam with new embroidery. The smith hammers out not only picks and wedges, but fine hinges for doors. Rings for wives whose hands carry the hush in silver bands. But when the seams tighten, the hush sharpens. Taverns fall quiet. Men mutter of distant fields. They might hire themselves to plow instead. The baron's steward tightens his lists, weighs each cart of ore twice, watches every sack for hidden lumps carried home in secret pockets. Above the shafts, spoil heaps grow, gray hills of broken stone and shattered hope, piled where the wind scatters grit into vegetable gardens and under thatch roofs. Chickens scratch among these piles for worms. Children dare each other to climb their slopes, slipping down in laughter that fades when fathers turn away. Shoulders bent beneath the same stones, the children toss back into the dusk. Through it all, the hush remains steady, never roaring, never silent. A soft breath that binds tunnels to timber beams, pick to coin, stone to prayer. Without the veins below, the chapel's bell would rust in its tower. The market square would crack and empty. The baron's manor would sink into memory. So the town hums on, a quiet tether between earth and sky, a place where every loaf of bread, every drop of ale, every stitched hem owes something to the hush below, a hush that waits always for the next footfall down the shaft, the next lamp lit in darkness, the next breath drawn where the sun never follows. The streets bend with the shape of the hillside, crooked lanes tracing old footpaths trodden first by shepherds before the picks bit into the veins below. Some houses lean outward so far their eaves almost touch above the narrowest alleys, wood beams bowing under the soft burden of years spent watching wagons grown up from the shafts, axles thick with mud and promise. Beneath the hush of everyday noise, small trades flicker to life in corners unseen by the manor's scribes. A woman stitches new seams into torn tunics beside a lantern fueled by tallow scraped together penny by penny. Her needle clicks while her youngest sleeps curled by the hearth, a thin blanket drawn tight against the draft that rattles the shutters each time the wind swings down from the spoil heaps. In a yard behind a blacksmith's forge, broken picks pile up in a neat stack, iron heads cracked along old strikes. Some are melted down when the fires are hot enough, reborn as nails, hinges, rough hooks for barn doors that swing in the constant wind. In a corner of the same yard, a cartwheel leans against the stone wall, half-mended, its spokes splintered from hauling or too heavy for any mule to bear without protest. At the tavern's door, a few men gather on rough benches, mugs braced on their knees. They trade news in voices low but steady, word of a new shaft cut into the hill's far side, of a cousin who vanished into the deeper drift last month, and whose name now sits folded inside the chapel's prayers. Laughter comes in soft snatches, never too loud, as if to keep the hush from listening too closely. When night drifts down, the streets tighten further. Smoke slides from low chimneys, the scent of stewed barley and old cabbage carried up to mingle with the sharp breath of damp stone. Children press cold noses to small windows to watch the shadows of men slip past, fathers and older brothers headed to a few hours of sleep before the bell calls them back at first light. On feast days, the hush swells with songs half sung in crooked Latin, hymns echoing against the stone walls of the chapel built with timber carted from the same forests, stripped bare to prop the tunnels. The priest's voice carries through streets so narrow that even a whisper finds its way under every eave. curling into dark corners where the hush knows every secret kept from the steward's lists. Merchants from farther towns sometimes come with carts piled high with goods too costly for everyday pockets. Bolts of wool dyed deep red, salt lumps hauled from distant coasts, thin knives folded in leather sheaths. The baron's steward strikes bargains under the manor's archway, his ledger growing thick with numbers that turn pick swings into silk threads and distant favors. But among the townsfolk, only the rare coin trickles down. A silver penny here, a copper clipped at the edge there, enough to trade for a blanket before winter settles its cold hands around the roofs. Above it all, the manor glows at night, its narrow windows lit by rush lamps that flicker against heavy drapes. No soot smudges those walls, no damp grit settles under boot heels on polished floors. The hush that breathes through the tunnels below drifts softly up here too, its cost hidden behind walls thick enough to keep the creak of timbers and cough of miners far from the polished table where the steward counts each cart and each drop of ore. Yet if you stand at the edge of town in the deep dusk, you see how closely the hush and the hum of life braid together. The spoil heaps lie like dark hills under the moon's pale sweep. Thin trails of smoke drift up from shafts, still warm with lantern light, far beneath your feet. The chapel bell stands silent for now, but its rope waits for the next toll, a call to prayer or warning or tribute, rung by hands that carry the same hush in every crack of skin and every quiet breath drawn beneath the weight of stone. This is the town, no louder than it must be, no poorer than the veins allow, no richer than the hush below decides. Each door opens to the same thin wind that hums down from hills whose bellies have been opened wide, yet never fully given up their secrets. Inside, the hush drifts through every timber beam, every rough wool blanket, the shutters like knuckles tapping a door. The mother pours out a thin broth or breaks a piece of rye bread, placing it into hands small enough to cup a lamp's warmth, but too young yet to follow that lamp into the shaft. Outside, the world hums with the sound of wagons trundling up the lane, of mule hooves splashing through ruts filled with last night's rain. But inside this hush, the child learns early that warmth is counted carefully. The heat of the hearth, the steam of the bowl, the rough wool cloak that must last another winter if the veins below stay true. Some days, a boy might carry his father's lunch down the slope, a cloth bundle of salted fish or hard cheese wrapped tight against the damp. He knows not to step too close. He knows the hush can swallow a careless footfall as easily as it swallows the pick's steady rhythm. Small hands gather firewood from the edge of the woods, where trees stand thinner now than in grandfather's tales. Sometimes they carry water from the spring behind the chapel, shoulders bent under buckets that slosh cold against their legs. School might come for some, a few precious hours with a priest who teaches letters, enough to tally wages, read prayers, sign a name on a contract for work that will one day bind small shoulders to the hush below. But lessons drift quick when the fields call for gleaning, when the shaft needs fresh hands to scrape the narrow seams where grown men cannot fit. A father's cough rattles softly in the dark. A mother's whisper settles the youngest back to sleep when dreams of tunnels press too close. Above the hearth, an old pick hangs on a nail, the first tool the father swung when he was no bigger than the boy curled under the rough blanket now, its edges worn smooth by small, curious fingers. In that toy's shape, lives a hint of hope that not every breath must vanish into the hush. Perhaps the child will find another way, a place in the steward's ledger, a chance to trade a pick for a quill. But in most homes, that hope is soft and small, wrapped tight around the hush like a blanket against a draft that never truly leaves. When the bell tolls at dawn, the lamp flares, sputters, steadies. A door creaks open to the cold air that smells faintly of ore and damp timbers, of a tunnel waiting below the roots of the town. Small feet shift under blankets, dreaming half of sunlight, half of shafts that open like mouths beneath the hills. A hush that knows each name before it's spoken aloud. Every morning is much the same. Quiet steps, the muted hush of a family moving in half-light, while the world outside still lies wrapped in mist. A younger sister stirs on the other side of a thin curtain hung for a bit of privacy. She clutches a scrap of cloth doll stitched from leftover seams, a small comfort against dreams that sometimes echo with the distant groan of timbers far below the hill. The hush teaches early, speaking of the seam struck last week, good or, if the props hold, a decent wage if the baron's steward keeps honest tallies. He hears how the hush below sometimes creaks and sighs like an old beast curling around its own ribs. Bare toes sink in mud by the spoil heaps where broken stone tumbles down in piles too poor to keep. Fool's silver that catches the sun for a moment before vanishing back into the hush when the wind scatters it among weeds and grass that refuse to grow thick on the torn hillside. Not deep, only to the mouth where the wagons stand waiting. There he learns to hold the pony's bridle while rough sacks are lashed tight, to listen for the quick calls and soft taps that mean it's time to move. The air tastes sharp, a mix of sweat, wet stone, and something older that makes the skin crawl, though no one names it too loud. At night, when the father's boots stand drying by the hearth, and the children gather close to the flicker of the last candle stub, stories slip into the hush. Not grand tales of kings or crusades, but stories of shafts that gave good silver in lean years, of tunnels that whispered warnings when the props strained too hard. A grandfather's tale of the old mine higher on the hill, now abandoned, its mouth half collapsed and grown over with briars that no child dares push through for fear of what breathes inside. Mothers wrap these stories in soft prayers spoken at the edge of sleep. They tell the youngest to dream of bright seams that open easy, of coins earned honest, of boots that hold together long enough to carry them a little further from the shadow of the spoil heaps. Yet, in the morning, the hush always waits, a thin mist rising from the fields, the sigh of iron wagons creaking under new loads. In spring, older children help carry baskets to the market in town. They stand silent beside the stall as their mother haggles for a better price on eggs, root vegetables, a twist of salt. Traders from bigger towns nod politely, their fine boots spattered with the same clay that cakes under the miner's child's nails. Sometimes a bright coin slips into a small palm, change for an errand run quickly through streets that smell of coal smoke and brewing ale. The hush hums here, too, between rows of stalls, behind the chapel's thick door where a child kneels beside parents whose hands stay folded tight. The chapel's walls hold the soft secrets of every family bound to the veins below, names muttered in prayer for safe returns, candles lit for shafts that did not hold. The child sees the wax drip slow onto stone and understands, even without words, that some promises stay buried as deep as any seam. Before sleep, small eyes watch shadows flicker on low beams, while the wind rubs the thatch above like an old hand. A wooden toy sits by the hearth, a horse carved from a leftover scrap of spoiled beans, its legs rough, its back smooth from a child's thumb. It waits by the ashes while the hush drifts through dreams, whispering gently of mornings yet to come, boots to be outgrown, and the tunnel mouth that opens wider every year. Beyond the rough beams and flickering lamps lies a deeper hush, a breath within the earth that miners fear more than the weight of stone or the snap of a rotten prop. This hush does not roar or groan like shifting rock. It slips in quietly, curls around a man's shoulders, and drifts into his lungs before he knows it's there. Down in the narrow drifts, air grows stale with every swing of the pick. A lamp flickers not only for lack of oil, but for lack of breath to feed its flame. The miners speak of bad air, foul pockets hidden in seams and hollows where wind cannot follow. They know the signs: a lamp that dims for no reason, a cough that bites deeper than dust alone, a faint dizziness that creeps up behind a man while his hands still clutch the pick. There are older names, too: black damp, choke damp, a miner's hush that presses close and pulls warmth from the body faster than a winter gust above ground. In these tunnels, a man learns to read the air the way a sailor reads the sea. A flutter of the flame, a sudden sweat on the brow, the strange stillness that settles when the shaft seems to hold its breath. All are warnings that the hush has teeth tonight. Boys crawl ahead with small lamps held low. They watch the flame's tongue dance and know to scramble back. If it shrinks to a pale point or flutters out in a single sigh, some drifts hold poison, gas that seeps from the stone like a ghost. Invisible, patient, a single careless spark can turn the hush into sudden thunder. A single drawn breath can turn lungs to lead. Sometimes the miners carry birds, small finches tucked in cages that swing from belts or hooks beside the lamp. A bird's sudden silence means the hush is too thick tonight. A dropped cage, a flurry of feathers, the cold dread that crawls up a man's neck faster than the chill of the damp rock. He knows then to crawl back fast as breath allows, or not at all. Above ground, the steward tallies wagons and coins, but rarely counts the hush that lives below. He knows the cost when a prop gives way or a shaft floods, but the cost of air is written in softer ink. A man who does not return, a boy who coughs through winter, a tunnel sealed forever with timbers nailed tight to keep the poison hush from slipping into drifts, still worth digging. When the hush moves quick, it takes not only breath, but light. A line of men swings picks deeper in, lamps steady at their feet. One flame flickers, dims, dies. The next does the same, like a line of candles snuffed out by an unseen hand. Shadows swell in the sudden dark. The hush closes in like a thick blanket pressed to the mouth. Those who survive speak little of it. Around the hearth, a wife might notice the new hush in her husband's voice, softer than before, rasping at the edges where laughter used to live. A child curls closer to the warmth of his side, listening to the wheeze that drifts from chest to cold night air. Yet every dawn brings them back. The pick waits where they left it. The lamp flickers awake. The hush, too, waits, deeper this time, pushed back only so far by the swing of iron and the trust that fresh air will follow the flame. If they press a shaft a little wider, a little closer to where wind still breathes, above ground the chapel bell tolls when needed. A new name scratched into the small board by the door. A candle lit beside a cold hearth, but beneath the earth, the hush holds every drawn breath like a ledger no steward sees. A soft, unseen cost pressed into stone and lungs alike. The price paid in silence, the quiet promise that the earth will always breathe back. Beneath the timbers and trickles of water, the hush changes shape. It thickens in pockets, seeps through cracks that look harmless in the flicker of a miner's lamp. The pick strikes stone again and again, but each blow stirs more than ore and dust. It stirs the earth's slow breath, hidden where sunlight has never reached. Miners learn to watch the flame like a second heartbeat. A healthy lamp stands tall and bright, its tongue steady. But when the hush grows heavy, the flame shrinks, gutters low, pulls itself inward as if afraid to taste the air. A man notices, always first, in the corner of his eye. His breath catches. He holds it without thinking. He touches the pick's shaft, feels how sweat has gathered along the grain. He glances at the boy working beside him, sees the boy's shoulders tighten, the lamp swinging just enough to show how narrow the tunnel really is. Voices drop to murmurs, or stop altogether. A single shout could draw down more than poison. It might bring the roof's weight down too. So they tap the handle of the pick on the tunnel wall. Once, twice, soft signals that pass like secrets. The hush has taught them to listen to stone as much as to air. Sometimes the air turns foul from the very timber that holds the earth at bay. Rotten wood gives up hidden gases when the damp eats into its grain. What once braced the tunnel now breathes slow poison into the lungs of men who trust that wood to hold back the hush and the stone's crushing patience. When the hush kills, it does so quietly. No roar, no sudden tremor to warn the village above. A man's knees buckle. He sinks into the mud at his feet. His hand leaves a smear on the wall where he tries to brace himself. His lamp tips sideways, its flame folding inward like a blossom at dusk. Those who find him hours later know the signs at once. No crushed bone, no broken brace, just the hush, turned sour and sharp, curled into a man's last breath. Some drifts hold deeper threats still, fire-damp pockets of gas, so volatile that a single spark can turn a drift into a tomb. A dropped lamp, a careless swing that strikes stone against iron, a nail pulled from a brace at the wrong angle. All feed the hush, a sudden mouthful of flame that roars for an instant, then leaves only smoke curling through the broken beams. To fight what cannot be seen, the miners carry small shields of ritual and habit. They wrap strips of cloth around lamp vents to soften the flame. They set damp moss along the floor to catch the bitter air before it climbs too high. A bird sings in its cage. If it falls silent, the pick falls silent too. In that moment, the hush wins. Above ground, these stories drift from hearth to hearth. Wives pass them down with quiet certainty. A cough that won't ease. A flame that guttered and flared again when the door was opened. Small signs that the hush is never far, always waiting for the next deep breath to taste. At the chapel, prayers rise for safe air as much as for safe timber. A candle flickers near the altar, the wax pooling slow as breath in cold lungs. Some drop a copper coin in the box beside it, hoping a saint's ear might catch what the hush would swallow. Yet the miners keep on. The tunnels press deeper each season. New veins promise brighter coins for the baron's chest, thicker bread for the table, a heavier blanket against winter's chill. So the pick swings, the lamp flickers, the hush drifts closer, never loud, always patient, a breath waiting beneath the breath, an unseen tide that remembers every drawn lungful and every silent promise that someday fresh air will follow the flame. Where stone presses close and air slips thin, the hush invites small secrets. Not every miner trusts timber alone to hold back the earth's patient hunger. Not every breath depends only on props and pickheads. There are other guards, older than any steward's ledger, signs scratched into beams, charms tied tight to lamp hooks, whispered words carried softly through tunnels where daylight never reaches. Before a man drops his first swing of the pick, he might rub his thumb across a smooth stone tucked deep in his pocket, a worry charm passed from father to son, its edges worn by years of damp palms tracing circles into its grain. Some hang bits of iron wire twisted into knots on the leather cord that holds the lamp. Iron wards off the deeper hush, so they say, the bad breath of the mine that no brace or brace bolt can tame. Near the mouth of the shaft, small figures of wood or clay hide in niches where only the oldest miners know to look. A tiny horse, a carved bird, a crude cross inked with soot and spit, left as a promise or a warning. So the hush remembers this breath belongs above ground, not sealed below. Boys learn early to spit 3 times before stepping past the lowest beam. They tap the timber with the pick's handle, not just to test the soundness of the wood, but to remind the hush that someone is listening. A quiet bargain. I hear you, so hear me too. Deeper down, strange marks crawl across raw rock faces. Old symbols, older than the priest's Latin prayers above. Spirals, slashes, little runes, scratched quick before a lamp burns out. Some swear they keep the gas from pooling. Others say they hold the roof up when the beams grow soft. Maybe they do nothing at all, but no man swings a pick near them without muttering a word first, just in case. When a shaft floods or a pocket of black damp drifts through, the hush takes new offerings. Bits of cloth tied to props, coins wedged under stones, a silver penny hidden where only the darkness knows its worth. Better to leave something behind than to tempt the hush to take it by force. Above ground mothers tuck sprigs of ash or rowan into their husbands' coat collars before dawn. A charm against sudden slips, a shield against timber that snaps with no warning. The children learn the old words too, half lullaby, half prayer, sung low while boots scrape mud at the threshold. In the chapel's shadow, the priest's candles burn bright and clean. Yet here in the hush, the old saints drift alongside older names. Saints for safe breath, saints for steady beams, saints for calm water running through drifts instead of flooding them. A man might whisper the name of his patron under his breath as the pick strikes, each swing a soft promise that he means to come back up before the sun slips down again. Sometimes a man does not return, then the hush carries his name instead. His mark scratched into a timber remains long after his boots dry by a hearth gone quiet. His charm waits in the same pocket, now tucked into the coat of a brother, a cousin, a boy just big enough to fit where the shaft bends tighter than before. So the hush listens. It presses in through damp seams and cracked beams, patient and silent. The pick swings, the lamp flickers. The small signs linger, where eyes look quick but hands trust deeply. A soft faith that old words and simple things can hold back what stone and breath alone cannot. Sometimes the hush does not come with poison in the air or fire in the gas. Sometimes it comes softly, cool and steady, slipping through cracks too fine to see. A slow breath of the earth turned to trickle, trickle to stream, stream to flood. But hope does not always hold. Water remembers old paths that no pick ever struck. It pools behind stone for seasons, for centuries, waiting for the small crack, the careless blow. The one swing too many that opens a door no man can close. When it comes, it does not roar at first, it sighs. A miner calls to his mates, voice-type pick handle, tapping a sharp warning against the wall. Others drop their tools, listen for the hush, turned into a soft, steady murmur behind the rock. Once it starts, the hush gathers strength. Drips become rivulets. Rivulets find seams to run faster. Lantern light flickers on the wet walls. Beads of water catching flame until the tunnel seems to sweat under the weight of its own fear. In the deeper drifts, water is the hush's swiftest keeper. It swallows tunnels, one timber at a time. Props creak and groan as damp earth presses heavy, mud thickening underfoot. Where once it was dry grit and scattered shards of bright ore, men rush for ladders set in rough stone shafts. Boots slip on wet rungs. Tools are left behind. No one carries a pick when the hush turns liquid and hungry. Some drifts hold narrow escapes, gasping men crawling belly deep through rising pools. Lamps held above water that licks at chins and lips and whispers how easy it would be to keep them here, still and quiet forever. Above ground, the village knows the sound before word comes. Wagons rattle in sudden haste. Women gather at the mouth of the shaft, listening for the slap of feet on muddy steps, for voices that rise through the hush and break the dark spell for another night. Sometimes they wait for hours. Sometimes they wait longer. The hush inside the earth matched by a hush in the hearts of those left above. When the water settles, the tunnels hold their secrets close. Some shafts are sealed with thick beams, nailed tight, marked with rough crosses and old words that no steward writes in ledgers. The hush keeps its claim. Broken picks buried in black mud, flickering lamps drowned and cold, the last swing of a pick forever pressed into walls slick with seepage. In time, new shafts open elsewhere. The water shifts underfoot, finds other cracks to wait behind, patient as breath held deep in the earth's lungs. Miners return with fresh timber, fresh prayers, fresh picks to strike the same old promise that the hush can be pushed back long enough to fill the baron's purse, the family's bowl, the chapel's candle stub. But in every tunnel, every drift, every chamber carved where sunlight never goes, that hush lingers, soft and steady. It seeps through seams, gathers in dark corners, drips from low ceilings until the next careless swing, the next thin crack, the next breath of water finds its way through stone once more. Sometimes the earth's hush is not the sound of timbers cracking or bad air stealing a man's breath, but a patient seep that gathers drop by drop until what began as a trickle grows teeth sharper than any pick. It begins as a dampness underfoot, just enough to darken the soles of boots and soak into cloth wraps wound tight around ankles to keep the chill from climbing bone. A miner notices the soft lap of water in a shallow dip. He squints at the rock face, sees the faint glisten in lamplight, the dark streak where stone should be dry. The old men say a wise man listens to a wall that weeps, for the earth gives warnings before it takes. A few props hammered in might hold for a while. Clay and straw stuffed into a crack might slow the hush's creeping hand. But no brace holds back a river for long. Behind the rock, the water gathers weight, an invisible tide pressing at the thin skin of the tunnel wall. Then comes the sigh. A sudden split, not a roar, not yet, but a hiss like a breath drawn sharp between teeth. The crack widens. The first rivulet spills forward, cold against boots already slick with mud. Men drop their picks and swing shovels, scrambling to wedge timber tighter, pack clay faster, patch the breach before the hush becomes a flood. Some nights it works. The hush forced back for another shift, another day's cart of ore. But sometimes the seam bursts wide, the wall folds in, water tumbling through in a black rush that swallows lamps, boots, voices. In these moments, the hush is no longer gentle. It swallows sound, the slap of feet slipping on stone, the scrape of hands clawing up ladders, hammered into rough walls, slick with fresh seep. A man calls back for a mate lost in the drift behind, but the hush answers with a rush of cold that drowns words before they reach any ear. Above, in the town clinging to the hillside, the first sign is often not the cry of alarm, but the sudden silence. Wagons wait at the shaft mouth, oxen stamping in the frost. Wives gather in shawls at the narrow lane where the spoil heap spills gray against the edge of vegetable plots. They watch for the first lamp bobbing up out of the dark, the small flame that promises another breath won back from the hush below. When it is too late, the water does not vanish. It stays, heavy and cold, filling tunnels with black pools that swallow timbers whole. Tools rust where they fell. A coil of rope drifts, snagged on a beam that no hand will touch again. Somewhere beneath that quiet surface lie picks that will never strike stone, boots that will never scrape the slope home. Sometimes, in dry years, the old flooded drifts are found again, tunnels sealed by timbers, now half-rotted, forgotten by ledgers, but remembered by fathers who once swung picks where sons now swing theirs. A miner wipes his brow, tests the air, lifts his lamp to peer at the dark pool glinting under rough beams. He knows the hush has not left. It sleeps behind the old clay plug, behind the soft sigh of stone, behind every faint drip that echoes like a heartbeat in the deep dark. The steward's ledger says the seam must be tested, that silver still waits where water once won. The pick strikes again. The hush watches. The flood remembers. Above the dripping shafts and cold hush of stone lies another hush, warmer, sharper, tasting of ash and sweat instead of damp clay and stale air. Here, the ore pulled from deep veins arrives rough and stubborn, locked inside rock that must be broken open again, this time by flame. Picture a smelter's yard at dawn. Low sheds huddle around a furnace built of stacked stone, darkened by years of soot and smoke. The air here is never still. A thin wind pushes the smell of charcoal and hot slag across the village, drifting through windows where wives mend shirts still stiff with grit from the tunnel mouth. Men stand in thick aprons, patched with old burns, faces lined with soot that no water fully scrubs away. They shovel charcoal into gaping mouths of brick kilns, eyes flicking to the low fire's tongue as it twists through rough lumps of rock piled in layers. Or charcoal limestone, the same cycle again and again. Each cart tipped onto glowing coals that breathe the hush upward in faint spirals of smoke. In the hush of the smelter yard, you hear not the pick's steady rhythm, but the rasp of bellows. Iron handles creak under calloused palms, leather lungs heaving air into the heart of the furnace, where stone softens and hidden silver runs free, trickling through channels cut into the hearth's base. Sometimes a boy stands at the smelter's edge, shoulders thin, eyes wide in the glow that dances on his cheeks. He watches a father or brother ease the slag aside with an iron rod, careful not to spill the small river of bright metal that drips into waiting molds. The hush here is broken only by the hiss of molten silver touching damp sand, the soft sigh of steam rising as hot meets cold. Old hands know the signs to watch for, the shimmer of the flame when the ore is right, the dark swirl that means too much slag, too little heat, a waste of fuel that must be paid for later from wages thinner than a winter broth, lurking behind the hush of the furnace walls. Charcoal burners up the hillside work by night to feed this fire, stacking brushwood in low mounds, blanketing it with earth to smolder slow until the logs surrender to ash and coal. Their smoke drifts across the same roofs that shake under the chapel bell. When the shaft gives way, or the hush claims another breath below, when the metal cools, what once lay hidden in rock comes clear. Small ingots, dull and heavy, stamped by the steward's iron seal before they roll away in carts, guarded as fiercely as any noble's treasury. A coin begins here, not at the mint in the distant city, but in this hush of sweat and flame, in the cough of a man who knows the difference between slag that breaks easy and a seam that yields its silver only under stubborn heat. At dusk, the last of the charcoal flickers to coals. The molds rest on a stone bench, warm to the touch. The men wipe sweat from brows, streaked dark by a day's worth of drifting ash. Lamps swing from pegs above the furnace mouth, the flame steady but small against the lingering glow of coals that will not die out until the night air finds its way in. When a smelter closes his eyes at his own hearth, the hush follows him. He feels it in the raw bite of his throat, the weight of cinders brushed from his sleeves. What the pick began in silence below, the fire finishes in silence above. A hush reshaped by flame into coin, tool, promise, the earth's secret, paid for in breath and sweat, made bright enough to pass through countless hands that will never feel the hush behind its shine. In the smelter's yard, the hush drifts not as silence, but as a hum, the faint pulse of bellows, the crackle of damp wood giving up its last spark, the slow hiss where molten or kisses wet sand. The work here is never loud, but never still. It sits halfway between the hidden hush of the shafts and the bright clink of coins that wait at the mint. Around the furnace, men move like shadows against stone walls, dark with soot rubbed deep by the passing of countless shoulders. They know each crack in the hearth's mouth, each sigh of the bricks as they expand in the heat that softens stone and frees metal from its rocky cage. In the dim glow, the ore changes shape and color, dull lumps giving way to small rivers that shine like dawn before they cool and dull again into lumps ready to cross a steward's table. Sparks flicker in the drifting ash when slag is raked aside, a brief shower of tiny stars swallowed by the hush before they touch the packed earth floor. The smell settles deep into hair and sleeves, charcoal smoke, burning limestone, the bitter tang of metal rising in vapor where molten streams meet the chill of the evening air. Even when the smelter walks home, boots scuffing the frost-thick lane that winds past shuttered cottages, the scent clings to him like the hush clings to every pick still striking in the drifts below. A boy might stand beside the stone bench where ingots cool eyes wide as he watches a father test each one with the flat tap of an iron rod. A dull note means trapped slag, metal not quite pure enough for the steward's measure. A clear, ringing note promises coin, coin that feeds the family's hearth, coins that pass from miner's breath to baron's purse and never linger long enough in the hands that know the hush best. Behind the forge, piles of broken rock wait for the next round. What the furnace cannot free this time may yield a little more next season, when the baron's coffers grow lean and the steward's lists run thin. Every handful of slag holds a whisper of promise. The hush never fully leaves, even when fire burns its secrets open. Farther up the slope, the charcoal burners watch thin smoke drift under starlight. Their mounds glow from within, slow-breathing hills that never roar but always feed the hush below with heat. They listen to the crackle and pop of trapped sap, the soft collapse of blackened wood. Their nights hum with the same quiet labor, rough hands turning brushwood to fuel that burns hot enough to melt stubborn stone. Sometimes, if you stand close to the furnace door when the draft is right, you hear the hush shift, a low hum that rides the heat, a ghost of the damp dark below the hill, now carried upward on breath, made bright by flame. The same hush that pressed cold into men's lungs now drifts skyward in threads of smoke, carrying pieces of the shaft's darkness far beyond the baron's walls. Yet here, too, the hush is paid for in sweat and scorched skin. A slip of the tongs, a splash of bright metal against bare wrist, small burns that scar deep. No prayers echo in these yards. The chapel's bell does not toll when a man's hands blacken at the edges from too many nights tending coals that eat through glove and skin alike. Still, each dawn brings them back. Wagons arrive at the yard's edge, wheels groaning under fresh or dragged up from the hush below. Boys unload sacks stained dark with rock dust. The smelter tests a lump between his thumb and palm, feels the grit crumble under rough skin already lined with soot. He nods once, tosses the lump into the pile that feeds the next mouthful of flame. By dusk, new ingots wait. warm in the cool night air, lined neatly along benches for the steward's men to count and weigh. The baron's mark will come later at the mint, but the true mark is here, in the hush of the fire that softens stone, in the calloused hands that shape earth's cold secret into something bright enough to carry a crest. Above the yard, smoke drifts toward stars, half hidden by drifting ash. A coin's shine begins here, not in the steward's tally, nor in the clink of silver passing palms in the tavern, but in the hush pressed from cold rock to glowing river, then shaped into metal that hums with every breath, lost to pick, shaft, flame. By the time the hush leaves the furnace yard, it has been folded into dull ingots, stacked neat in carts that creak through muddy lanes, bound for stone halls where the last secret is pressed flat under iron dies and steady hammers. Picture the mint, thick walls of rough-cut stone rising in a market town that owes its hum to veins carved out of the hillside miles away. No pick swings here, no flame softens or here. The hush lives in the quiet shuffle of scribes tallying weights, in the low murmur of guards who stand by doors bound with heavy iron bands. Inside, the hush hums with a sharper edge, the ring of hammer on die, the soft clink of coins poured into leather sacks. Men in simple tunics and leather aprons lean over low workbenches under windows set high to catch what little daylight they can. Oil lamps swing from iron hooks, throwing shadows over faces lined not with soot but with the fine grit of silver filings that settle on skin like frost. Each ingot is weighed twice, turned over in careful hands that know how to test for slag hidden inside, for flaws that could weaken the stamp of the baron's crest. A coiner lifts the metal to the light, tilts it, knocks it once against the bench. If it rings clear, the hush hidden in rock and flame is ready to wear a mark the whole realm trusts. A boy stands to one side, working the bellows that keep the small forge alive. Not the roaring furnace of the smelter yard, but a tight, fierce flame, just hot enough to soften silver before the hammer drops. His fingers are black with soot and ash. A faint echo of the shaft's grime clinging to hands too young yet to swing a pick, but old enough to feed the hush onward. One by one, the blanks are shaped, discs cut smooth, edges trimmed sharp against an iron die. The hush pauses here in each heartbeat of the hammer, raised high, held steady, dropped clean. The stamp strikes with a flat clang that rings off stone walls and echoes through the mint's dark rafters. The baron's crest, a loop of letters, the weight and measure pressed into what once lay hidden in rock where no sun shines. Sometimes a crack shows, a coin that splits along a fault no eye could catch, a spoiled piece tossed back into the scrap, melted down to try again. No flaw must pass, for silver is trust, trust is tax. Tax is power that feeds back down the lane to the shaft, the smelter, the spoil heap. Outside, merchants wait with chests lined in wool. The steward stands nearby, eyes narrow, ledger open, counting each stack as it slides from mint hall to cart to strongbox, bound for some far cathedral or the purse of a knight, mustering men for yet another border feud. No man who swings the hammer owns the hush he shapes. No boy who feeds the forge sees his own name carved in wax seals, pressed into warm metal, still soft from the die's kiss. Yet the hush hums through every coin, the breath that once scraped a miner's ribs, the the sweat that trickled through pick handles, the sigh of water that flooded old drifts now pressed silent into a thin, bright circle that spins far beyond the hills. When dusk drifts over the mint, the last coins cool on wooden trays. The hammer rests, the dies are wiped clean of filings. A scribe counts soft clinks into neat rows, marking sums that fill the baron's books with the same hush that once filled the shaft. A promise pressed small enough to carry, bright enough to vanish into other hands, old enough to remember how cold rock once whispered it here. Inside the mint's thick stone belly, the hush moves with a steady rhythm, not the restless hush of dripping tunnels or the sharp hiss of molten ore, but a measured metallic heartbeat. The hammers fall, the clink of silver discs dropped one by one into waiting trays. Along a narrow bench, blanks rest in neat stacks, dull discs waiting for a final breath of fire before they wear the mark that ties them to the baron's purse. A coiner checks each one with fingertips scarred by years of small burns and tiny cuts. The hush has its bite here too, a different sting than stone or black damp, but no less patient. The small forge hums at the center of this hush, fed by bellows that wheeze and sigh with each press of a boy's foot. Leather lungs breathe heat into the coals until they glow like the veins the pick once chased in cold earth. A coiner lifts each blank into the flame, tilts it just long enough to soften its skin but not its heart, then sets it on the waiting die. The hammer rises, a breath held. The hush gathers around the moment the iron drops. The stamp hits true, a crest, a loop of lettering, a weight pressed so deep into the soft silver that no trade, no market, no tavern hand can question what lies within. A small ring fills the mint's gloom. Another coin joins the hush that hums through sacks and strongboxes waiting by the door. Dust gathers under the coiner's nails, not the dark grit of the shaft, but a fine silver bloom that settles in the lines of his palm. A fortune, if gathered grain by grain, but no hand keeps what the hush gives up here. The filings drift away on the forge's breath, caught in the sweep of an apprentice's brush, reclaimed to melt again for the next batch waiting in the steward's ledger. In the far corner of the mint, an older man counts by lamplight, sliding finished coins into thick leather bags lined with waxed linen to keep the shine safe from damp. His breath clouds the air as dusk seeps in through the high windows. A hush within the hush, the slow measure of wealth that binds lord to peasant, pick to purse. Sometimes a coin sticks in the die. The mark is blurred, the edge bent where the metal folded under the hammer's strike. It is dropped into the reject bin without ceremony. No crest must leave the mint with a flaw that might breed suspicion in faraway markets. Even here, the hush demands perfection, a promise struck clear, a whisper pressed in bright metal that carries the breath of the tunnel farther than any miner ever walks. Outside the mint's walls, the hush grows louder in its own way. Carts rattle on worn wheels, iron-bound and watched by guards, whose pikes catch the dawn's edge as they march beside strongboxes bound for distant mints, cathedrals, garrisons. The hush has become cargo now, the earth's secret, hammered into shape, ready to feed roads and kingdoms far beyond the hills that cradle the spoiled heaps of spent rock. Yet within each coin, the hush hums, quietly still, a trace of pickswing, the creak of timbers deep under stone, the sigh of water that waits behind seems not yet struck. In every market, every merchant's pouch, every tithe chest cracked open before a candlelit altar, The hush lives on, flattened and bright, but never truly silent. At night, when the mint's doors close, and the last hammer rests beside its die, a thin drift of filings settles on the cold stone floor. The hush settles with it, patient as ever, reminding the hands that count, stamp, and weigh that the earth gives only what it keeps in secret first. When the last hammer rests, and the final stack of fresh minted coins leaves the mint's hush behind, the silver does not sit still for long. It rolls outward like water down a hillside, carrying the hush of stone and flame into places where no pick ever swings and no tunnel ever breathes. First come the baron's coffers, deep chests lined in iron, lids bound with heavy locks, whose keys never leave the steward's belt. Coins stacked there in neat rows, each stamped crest a promise that the hush below has fed the hush above. From these coffers, payments flow, wages to guards who stand watch at the manor's gate, fees to scribes who ink new ledgers, tributes sent up the chain to dukes or distant kings whose reach extends far beyond these hills. Then the church takes its share. The hush follows the coin through stone arches and dark chapels where incense curls in slow spirals under vaulted beams. Here, silver brightens candle flames, drifts into tithe chests kept behind iron grills, fills poor boxers lined in worn velvet. A miner's breath-turned coin might pay for a new altar cloth, a silver chalice lifted by a priest who mutters Latin prayers over bread and wine, while the hush listens from the walls. Above the shafts, the steward rides from cottage to cottage when the harvest comes due. A portion of rye for the mill, a portion of wool for the baron's store, but always the coin. To a small pouch slipped into the steward's waiting hand, its weight judged with a glance and a nod. Not every miner pays in silver. Some barter with sacks of ore yet unsmelted, some with labor promised to patch roads or mend fences swallowed by spring floods. Yet behind each bargain is the hush, the memory of where the silver was born, struck, and measured. Merchants gather in the village square to weigh their share as well. Coins pass between chapped fingers, sticky with ink and salt. A bolt of cloth traded for silver, bright enough to glint in candlelight above a hearth. A chain of new iron nails, bartered by a carpenter, who pockets 3 coins and flicks a prayer to the hush that the shaft holds steady through the winter storms. Beyond the village, the hush carried in coins, crosses, borders, caravans creak under bolts of fine wool and lumps of tin bound for distant foundries. The silver rides hidden in lockboxes, under hay bales and sacks of salted fish. At crossroads, toll keepers lift the lids, test each coin's mark with a merchant's trained thumb. The hush hums under each bright ring, a tiny echo of dripping tunnels, hot furnaces, boys tending bellows, late into dusk. Sometimes the coin returns to the same hills where it was born. A mason's hammer bought with silver pays for new beams to brace a drift that sags to near collapse. A widow presses a coin into the steward's palm to buy the right to glean grain from the Lord's fields when the shaft's hush has claimed her husband's breath for good. A miner fingers a silver penny by the tavern hearth, testing its weight before sliding it across a counter for a pint of ale and a moment's warmth against the hush waiting in the dark. Through it all, the hush never loses its claim. A coin might shine in a bishop's treasury, line a baron's purse, vanish into a merchant's lockbox bound for a port city far beyond the hills. Yet somewhere in its thin ring is the faint breath of tunnels that breathe no light. Every silver crest is stamped with trust, but inside the trust lives the hush of stone split by sweat, of bad air tasted in shallow lungs, of timbers creaking under worlds no steward counts. When the church bell rings for evening prayer, the coins drift with it, a hush carried upward in bronze chimes, echoing back through the narrow lanes and spoil heaps, reminding each hearth that the earth below never stops whispering. The hush, once hidden in rock, now hums in every trade, every tithe, every small bargain struck before the next dawn. Once pressed and weighed, the hush inside each coin does not lie still. It slides from palm to palm like a secret, too soft to speak aloud, but heavy enough to bind roofs to steeples, bread to table, a shaft's deep breath to a distant lord's polished hall. The steward's boots mark muddy paths from the manor gate to the low stone cottages that huddle close to the hillside. He pauses at each door, ledger balanced on his arm, quill hovering while rough hands dig deep into cloth pouches tied at belts worn thin from years spent bent over picks and sledges. A single silver coin pressed onto the steward's palm might weigh less than a handful of ore, yet it hums with the hush of every breath drawn beneath the beams that hold the hill at bay. Some families pay their share with quiet pride, a fair tithe kept aside from lean wages, offered with bowed heads and small nods that speak of duties done and old debts balanced for another season. Others bargain in whispers, an extra loaf promised at harvest, a day mending the baron's broken fence, a piglet traded for the steward's patience when coins run short and the hush presses harder than any winter wind. Beyond the village lanes, the hush trickles uphill into places the miners seldom see. In the baron's counting room, coins tumble from sacks onto wide oak tables scarred by the weight of years, and ledgers heavy with neat columns of ink. Scribes tally each stack twice, scratching soft notes that speak of tribute owed to a duke to valleys away, or a bishop whose cathedral vault swallows hush in silence as steady as stone. From these tables, some coins buy comfort the shaft will never know. Bolts of linen brought in by traders who cross forests and flooded rivers to reach the baron's hall. Fine salt traded for barrels of smoked fish to feed the manna kitchens through a hungry winter. Iron nails, chains, and hinges forged by blacksmiths whose hammers strike their own hush into iron bars that brace gates and doors. In the church, the hush takes shape in softer ways. It lingers in the warm flicker of candles lit for souls whose breath failed in the shaft's damp dark. It drifts through the sweet tang of incense, drifting above altar stones, polished by a priest's slow hands. A single silver penny might brighten a saint's carved halo, mend a torn vestment's hem, by wine pressed from vines no miner will ever see. Here, the hush trades for prayers, whispered in Latin, sung in slow hymns that rise through rafters, blackened by centuries of smoke. Coins feed roads, to some vanish into stones, laid by tired laborers, hired to patch the ruts that wagons cut deep into muddy lanes, hauling or from shaft to smelter to mint. A miner's breath pressed into silver might pay for a stone mile marker set along the edge of a forest track, a sign that points trade carts safely back to the same hillside that hides the hush waiting for the next pick's swing. Merchants feel the hush in each fair held on saints' days and feast days when wagons line the square. Wheels sunk in straw scattered to soak up spring mud, Silver passes quickly here. A new tool, a jug of fresh cider, a scrap of lace stitched by a weaver who hums her own quiet tune while coins slip into her apron. Yet every trade echoes backward. The hush behind the pick, the hush beneath the timber props, the hush that first breathed silver into the stone, now bright on the merchant's palm. Farther out, the hush rides hidden in caravans bound for distant markets. Coins struck in the village mint jingle, in purses opened in distant towns, whose cobblestones never felt a miner's boots. Some hush pays for iron spears, salt blocks, bolts of wool, dyed with colors no tunnel has ever seen. Still, inside the shine, that soft promise whispers that someone swung a pick where water drips, that someone else melted slag under a low roof, that the hush always costs breath first before it buys promise for someone far above. In the chapel, the hush waits for the last bell of the day. A priest lifts a thin silver coin, tracing the crest pressed into its heart before dropping it into a locked box, lined with velvet grown thin from years of quiet offerings. His whisper drifts with the hush, a prayer for souls still digging, still breathing, still paying, one coin at a time. Beyond the spoil heaps and chapel bells, the hush rides hidden inside the baron's coffers until it spills out again in orders given by candlelight and letters, sealed with thick wax, stamped by a heavy ring. Here, the silver torn from damp tunnels does not rest in quiet chests. It turns to steel, harness, and hooves that thunder along distant roads where the hush hums in a new voice. Picture the great hall of a lord whose lands spread wider than the eye can follow from the manor's highest tower. His boots rest on rushes strewn across flagstones, cool even in summer. Along the wall, weapons gleam, swords with hilts wrapped in leather, spears with iron points polished bright by servants' patient hands. Each blade, each bolt of mail, each horseshoe nailed to a restless steed's hoof hums with the hush pressed first into coins struck in the village mint. The steward stands at the lord's elbow, ledger open, quill scratching out sums that turn silver lumps into rows of sharpened spears. New mail, barrels of oats for horses, bred strong enough to carry armored men through muddy fields and across frozen rivers. Each number hums softly of the hush buried under hillside and chapel alike. Not far away, blacksmiths shape the hush into new forms. In forges hot enough to warp iron's stubborn grain, they draw long blades from thick bars, test each edge against whetstones that hiss under trickles of water. Sparks leap and fall in small constellations that echo the hush of old slag piles left behind at the smelter's yard. Steady, bound to work that costs sweat and promises danger. In the stable yard, boys tighten buckles on thick leather harness. Check the fit of iron shoes shaped by village smiths, whose grandfathers once swung picks instead of hammers. Each hoof that stamps the frozen ground waits to carry the hush farther than any shaft ever dug, into forests where borders blur. Across valleys where farmers watch armored riders pass in tight lines that leave mud churned to ruin behind them. The hush hums in banners too. The same crest pressed into coins, now stitched in bright thread onto cloth lifted high on a cold wind. Men gather under that cloth, breath fogging in dawn air. Some once bent backs to picks and sledges before the steward found better coin for strong arms and restless hopes. They lift spears in place of shovels, swing swords where once they swung axes to split rough timbers for new props underground. Each blow struck on a muddy field feeds the hush again. A lord's promise to his king, paid in silver mined far below a hillside the soldiers may never see again. A blacksmith's mark, hidden on the blade of a sword, snapped in battle and left behind in some shallow ditch no map will mark. The hush knows this trade well. For centuries, silver has fed steel. Steel has fed ambition. Ambition has fed the hush below. A baron's quarrel turns to a skirmish on a field where miners' sons stand shoulder to shoulder with farriers, apprentices, and woodsmen pressed into service, when the hush in the coffer runs low and fresh veins must open elsewhere to feed new promises. In time, the hush drifts back from the battlefield to bent armor, sold for scrap, returns to the forge, melted down beside spoils carried in battered carts, coins looted from distant chapels, minted under foreign crests, find their way back to the same mint where the hush first drew breath in dull ingots lifted from a muddy cart. Long after banners fall and helmets rust in fields forgotten by all but patient grass, the hush waits beneath the spoil heaps where new picks test old seams. The same silver that gleamed in a knight's purse now hums in fresh veins pressed deeper in the stone, waiting for another lamp to flicker into the shaft and another swing to free it all over again. The hush that began as a quiet pick strike under dripping beams moves far from the damp stone once the coin leaves the mint. It marches beside riders in chainmail, hums in the rattle of armor, packed in wagons drawn by teams of sturdy draft horses, each hoofshod in iron paid for by silver once hidden deep in the hillside's throat. In the manor's solar, the baron leans over a map stretched flat across a heavy table scored with knife marks and candle burns. Small weights pin the corners to keep the parchment steady when a window's draft sighs through the cold room. Lines mark forests, rivers, villages, loyal or wavering. Dots mark tribute to be collected, coin to be promised. In the yard below, squires tighten straps around packs heavy with iron heads for axes and spear points. Fletchers shape arrow shafts from hazel and goose quill. The soft rustle of feathers brushing workbenches dark with old wax and oil. Each arrow head's sharp tip hums faintly of the hush that fed the forge or prized loose in tunnels, where miners pressed fingers to beams before trusting the hush to hold another hour. Camp followers mend torn surcoats under the thin light of dawn. Cloth dyed in colors to match the crest stamped on silver coins slides through raw fingers cracked by cold and rough soap. Some wear amulets tied on thin leather strips, small reminders of the hush traded for steel. Boys too young for spears, 10 mules heavy with barrels of iron nails and lengths of chain rattling soft as wind in the trees. On the march, the hush hums beneath the clatter of armored boots. Knights with polished helms and lances point toward rival keeps built on promises just as deep, just as hungry for silver turned steel. Each shout in the melee, each clash of blade and shield rings with the hush that began far from the battlefield. In the soft drip of water down a mine wall, the swing of a pick that freed the coin now pressed into the pommel of a sword. At night, campfires glow in shallow hollows dug to hide sparks from wandering eyes. In the hush between talk of feuds and treaties, men rub coin edges smooth with idle thumbs. Some share the same coins earned in the shaft, traded first for bread, then for ale. Then for iron and steel, sharpened by forges they will never see. The hush drifts with them in soft prayers, muttered before sleep, that the blade holds, that the horse stands, that the hush back home has not claimed another brother, while they march beneath a lord's bright banner. Hooves churn soft fields into mud thick with iron and breath. Silver hidden in purse and pummel becomes the hiss of arrows slicing dawn air. The cold ring of sword edge on mail links. A knight's armor. Plates shaped by coin, paid for in dripping tunnels. Splinters under a hammer. Swung by another man whose father once bent over the same seam of rock. After the battle, the hush does not vanish. Broken blades and dinted helms are gathered by carters, who will sell iron scraps to forges that know how to breathe new heat into old steel. A bent spur might find its way to a village smith who melts it down beside iron drawn fresh from deeper seams, fed again by picks that test the hush all over. The baron sits at a high table once more, map rolled tight under an arm, coins counted by the steward, who knows how many spears must be paid before winter comes. The hush that hummed in tunnels now hums in the shifting sums that mark which veins must be dug deeper, which old shafts must open again. For every blade dulled in the fields will call for fresh steel, and fresh steel calls for fresh hush drawn from stone and breath. So the quiet promise never truly breaks. What the earth gives, the forge sharpens. What the forge shapes, the Lord commands. What the Lord demands, the pick must find again. Between rock and flame, crest and blade, the hush settles deeper than any grave on the field, patient, waiting for the next map to open, the next purse to empty, the next breath to vanish below the old beams. When the last lamp flickers out, and the final wagon groans up the muddy slope, bearing the last cart of ore worth the steward's tally, the hush deepens. Tunnels once alive with the ring of picks, and soft murmurs of men bend quietly into darkness again. Claimed by the same earth they yielded for so long. Picture a drift half collapsed, timbers bowed under weight they can bear no more. A trickle of water seeps down a narrow seam, pooling in the hollow where once a boy knelt to shovel loose rock into a waiting sledge. The lamp that once swung gently from a nail is gone. Only the faint stain of soot blackens the low beam above where it burned for hours at a time. Soft flame pushing back the hush one swing at a time. The old props stand crooked. Some broken wear rot set in the day. The last boots stamped the mud and turned away. A lone pick, its handle cracked, leans against a wall where the rock still bears the marks of its final blows. Even now, centuries later, you can trace your fingertips along the grooves cut by hands that knew how to listen for the hush, pressing back through the stone. In the village above, the hush changes shape when the shaft closes. Some families drift away to other hillsides where rumors promise new veins, richer seams. Others stay behind, tending small plots carved into the edges of the old spoil heaps where wild grass grows thin but stubborn. Children dare each other to creep close to the sealed drift's mouth, where timbers nailed across the opening hold back more than loose earth. They say the hush inside can breathe you in if you linger too close. A whisper in the dark that remembers every name spoken there. Sometimes, in a dry season, water slips away and leaves part of the old shaft open to the curious or the desperate. A father who once swung a pick here might bring a son to the drift's edge, pointing out marks on a wall, a notch carved as a sign where the seam forked left instead of right. No new or weights now, but the hush hums beneath their feet all the same. A reminder that the stone keeps secrets long after the last coin minted from its veins is spent far from this hillside. In winter, the hush settles thick under snow that drifts over spoil piles like a blanket. Foxes dig burrows into old tailings, and the wind rattles loose boards nailed across forgotten mouths. Sometimes a faint warmth rises from deep below, the earth's own, breath seeping up through cracks where the timbers rot and give way to damp air warmer than the frost above. Miners' tales linger too. Old men who remember the taste of black damp, the drip of water that threatened to drown whole drifts, the hiss of a lamp guttering out when the hush pressed too close. They sit by hearths in cottages built from stone, pulled from the same hillside, spinning stories for grandchildren who press close to the glow. They speak of lost tunnels braced with iron rails that rusted in silence after the last wagon rattled away, rails that might still gleam faintly in lamplight if someone were brave enough to slip under the rotting beams. Yet the hush does not die when the shaft goes still. It waits beneath the moss that creeps over old mine tailings, beneath brambles that tangle across paths once trod by boots heavy with grime. Some say the hush seeps back into the veins, curling around pockets of untouched or too thin or too deep for the old picks to reach. They say it hums there like a promise, patient as ever, waiting for new hands to swing iron at stone once more. No steward tallies these drifts now. No baron leans over maps in candlelit chambers, counting the promise of silver hidden under timbered beams. Only the hush remains, soft, steady, pressed deep under hills that remember every breath, every whispered bargain, every small light that flickered in the dark before the earth swallowed it again. As the last seams tighten and the picks grow quiet, the hush grows wider than the tunnels themselves. It seeps into the empty sheds at the shaft's mouth where tools once hung in neat rows, iron heads polished smooth by hundreds of rough palms, handles splintered and rewrapped with strips of hide. Now they lean forgotten in corners, blades dulled by damp air and the slow patience of rust that creeps in like moss through a cracked wall. In the older workings, deeper still, the hush becomes a second skin to the stone. Water drips slow along beams that sag under decades of steady weight, trickling down pillars carved from the living rock when timbers ran short or costs ran too high. Sometimes a shaft stands wide as a chapel nave, its ceiling lost in dark where the lamp's glow cannot reach. Here the hush gathers itself in echoes, the creak of a brace shifting with the frost, the faint sigh of air slipping through seams left behind when miners struck deeper veins elsewhere. No voices call down these drifts now. No footsteps slap through puddles that gather at low points, where boots once left muddy prints that dried and cracked like old parchment. Instead, tiny lives move through the hush, pale insects, blind rodents, bats who slip in through broken seams when summer's heat drives them down to cool corridors. The miners carved by torchlight. Above ground, the spoil heaps lie like low gray hills where nothing grows thick. Children climb them on warm days, feet scattering loose rock that rattles down to settle again, a soft hush that mimics the drifts below. They pick through broken stone, hoping for a glimmer of fool's silver, a shard of ore left behind, a small piece of the hush they can tuck into a pocket and carry home like treasure. At the old shaft mouth, brambles clutch at rotting beams, nailed into place by the last men who close the drift for good. Sometimes a plank slips loose in spring rains, revealing a black throat that breathes cold air up to meet the wind. On foggy mornings, that breath curls above the opening like smoke from a dying hearth, reminding passersby that the hush below never fully sleeps. Some shafts find new purpose in strange ways. A farmer builds his sheepfold against the old spoil pile. Stone walls half made of tailings pried from the hillside's belly. A tinker shelters in the drift's low entrance. When storms roll down from the high ridges, pressing his back against cold stone while rain pounds the brambles above. They say if you sit there too long, you might hear the hush speak, the soft tap of a pick from somewhere far beyond the timbers, the echo of boots crossing pools where no boot has stepped for half a lifetime. Elders in the village remember when the hush roared louder, when wagons rattled down muddy lanes at dawn, iron-shod wheels carving ruts deep enough to swallow a child's boot. Now grass pushes through those ruts in thin green blades, bending in the same wind that hums through empty sheds and cracks in chapel doors left ajar when the miners drifted away. Yet the hush never truly leaves. It waits in the stories told by the hearth, of a cousin lost to a sudden flood, of a father who struck a rich seam so deep it took 2 days to haul the last cart out before the props gave way for good. Sometimes these stories are told, like warnings to those who dream of picking at old beams in search of a hidden pocket no steward ever marked in his neat books. Time does its slow work, too. The beams soften under moss and wet earth. Iron bolts give way. Shallow pits cave in when spring thaw swells hidden rivers behind old seams. What the hush once yielded it sometimes takes back. Tunnels, swallowing themselves inch by inch until only a soft depression in a field hints that anything ever lay beneath. Still, the hush hums patiently, deeper than any ledger or baron's crest. It remembers each breath traded for silver. It holds tight every mark carved into beams by small knives, every scratch that tallied shifts in flickering lamplight. It waits, quiet as soil, settling over old tools, soft as brambles curling across broken planks, patient enough to whisper that nothing taken from the earth is ever truly lost, only buried deeper, where the hush keeps its own counsel, far from the reach of any pick. When a mine closes, its hush does not stay buried. It drifts upward, settles into stone foundations, timber frames, leaning fences that outlasts the last wagon and the last flicker of lamplight far below. Picture an old headframe, the wooden scaffold, once crowned with pulleys and rope, beams blackened by weather and the soft bite of time. It leans at an angle against the sky, no longer creaking under the weight of buckets hauled, heavy with ore, but creaking all the same when the wind slips through joints loosened by seasons of frost and thaw. Near it, a pile of stones marks where a sorting shed once stood, a few slabs squared by rough chisels, now half sunk into grass and nettle. Bits of rusted iron poke up where nails once pinned planks tight to keep out rain and snow. If you kneel here, brush aside the weeds, you might find a shard of broken clay pipe, a bent hinge, a fragment of old leather strap, small relics dropped by hands that trusted these walls to hold back more than weather. A trail winds down from these ruins toward the spoil heaps, now softened at the edges by decades of rain and roots. Young trees find purchase where once the carts rolled heavy and loud. Their roots twist through the hush left behind, pushing into pockets of stone packed with shards of ore too poor to haul away. In spring, wildflowers cling to these gray slopes, a splash of color that hides the hush humming below. Not far off, the shell of a manager's house sits roofless under open sky. Window frames gape empty. The hearth that once held a fire for ledgers and stewards now holds only blown leaves and bits of old thatch carried in by crows. Some walls lean in slow surrender, stones pressing down toward the same earth that gave up the hush now settled inside them. Children from the village come here on warm days, slipping through broken gates to stand where the wind rattles loose slates on a shed's sagging roof. They dare each other to peer into old storage pits, half filled with rainwater and blown dust. They find nails bent in odd shapes, lumps of slag worn smooth by time, small iron wedges they tap together like dull bells before slipping them into pockets. Trophies carried home to sit on windowsills as reminders that the hush once fed these hills. Even the chapel keeps a hush of its own. Stained glass long gone, roof beams cracked under moss. Its bell tower empty but for sparrows nesting where the rope once swung prayers into cold morning air. Still, a stone basin waits inside, dry now but smooth as river rock, worn by countless fingers, dipped in holy water before men slipped down the slope to the drift's mouth at dawn. On quiet evenings, the hush drifts through these ruins like smoke from an old hearth. It settles on the rough stone walls, whispers under broken doors, curls through grasses grown tall where wagons once left deep grooves in the earth. It hums in relics too stubborn to vanish. The iron hook still nailed into a beam above a drift's closed mouth. A bit of leather belt wedged into a crevice where a miner hung his lamp before stepping into the sun for the last time. Time softens edges, but does not erase the hush. It breathes through these relics when rain taps gently on rusted iron, when the wind runs fingers along half-collapsed fences. It hums in the soft footsteps of those who wander here now, curious, cautious, half listening for the echoes that linger in old timbers and broken walls. What remains above ground is not grand, not towers or gates meant to stand forever, but small things that hold the weight of every pick swing, every soft prayer, every hush pressed deep into the hillside's bones. Stones stacked by hands now long returned to the same soil, iron bent by sweat and time, a path trod smooth by boots that carried the hush home, one shift at a time. When the last stone wall softens into moss, and the last rusted nail falls through rotted timber, the hush finds its truest shape. Not a roar, not even a sigh, but a slow breath drawn deep into the hills that keep every secret pressed close. Picture yourself standing at the edge of what was once a drift's mouth. No boards now, no lanterns flickering against dripping beams. Only brambles tangled thick across a hollow that exhales a hush cold enough to raise the small hairs on your wrist. If you reach through the leaves, the wind carries nothing louder than the soft rattle of dry stems knocking against old stone. Around you, the spoil heaps slope low under grass that bends and whispers when evening comes down. Wildflowers lean over seams of broken rock that once fed coins to kings, fed bread to quiet tables, fed steel to spears that clashed far from these quiet slopes. Now the hush hums through roots and bracken, a breath that waits for no pick, no tally, no steward's ink. Somewhere nearby, an old fence leans around what was once a miner's cottage. Its roof is gone, its hearth cold, but if you step inside the threshold, you might still hear the hush brushing the stone. The same hush that filled boots with mud at dawn, that clung to rough shirts hung by the fire to dry before another shift pressed them back into darkness. Above ground, the chapel's bell has long since fallen silent. A single beam rests across the stone floor, where children once knelt for a blessing before trudging down the slope to wait at the shaft's mouth. The hush drifts through broken glass and settles under the old altar, where wax once pooled from candles lit for safe returns. At night, when clouds pull back and the hills lie dark under the sweep of cold stars, the hush breathes slow and patient. It gathers every name that ever whispered a hope into the mind's damp dark. Every child's footprint stamped into frost, while waiting for a father's lamp to reappear. Every last swing of a pick wedged into the hush so deep that no wind can carry it away. Imagine lying here under the hush, the ground cool beneath your back, the hill rising over you like a slow wave frozen in stone. The wind tugs gently at grass grown from spoil heaps long since swallowed by time. The stars above drift unchanged, the same stars that watched the first pick strike the vein, that watched the last coin stamped, the last prayer whispered, the last name carved in the chapel's door. Breathe slowly now. Feel how the hush softens each breath, how it folds around you like a blanket stitched from soil, old timbers, and forgotten seams. There is no pick here now to strike the hush apart, no ledger to weigh the hush in tidy sums, no steward to measure what the hush has kept for itself. What the miners took, they returned in time. Breath for stone, sweat for silver, prayers for quiet sleep. The hush remembers. It remembers the weight of boots on muddy planks, the tap of iron on stone, the slow slip of water through seams unseen. It remembers each lamp's glow flickering out in the far drift, the first light flickering on when a boy grew old enough to swing his own pick. Tonight, the hush needs nothing from you but your slow breath drifting with the grass, your thoughts sinking deeper than any shaft ever dug. Let the last hush cradle you the way it cradles rusted rails and broken props, softly, patiently, pressing each story deeper into earth that never forgets. And when you sleep here, under hills that hum with old secrets, know the hush will keep watch as it always has, gentle, patient, the last breath of a mind that never truly goes silent, only deeper.